My sister thought she had won when she emptied our family's accounts while I was fighting for my life in a hospital bed. She even had the audacity to smile at me during the will reading, probably thinking I was too broken to fight back. But that smile vanished the moment the executor revealed what our grandfather had really left behind. A truth that would change everything forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Looking back at that moment now, I still get goosebumps. Not, because of the money or the property, but because of the lesson life taught me about patience, perseverance, and the way justice sometimes arrives in the most unexpected ways. I suppose I should start from the beginning. My name is Eliza Carter, and I grew up in the quaint coastal town of Millbrook Harbor, where the scent of salt water mingled with the fragrance of my grandfather's prized rose garden. Growing up, our family wasn't wealthy by conventional standards, but we were rich in other ways. At least that's what Grandpa Theodore always said. He had built a modest shipping business after returning from the war, turning a single boat into a small fleet that served the local fishing industry and nearby coastal towns. My sister Vanessa was 3 years older than me, always more ambitious, always reaching for something beyond our small town's boundaries. Where I found joy in helping Grandpa with his ledgers and learning the business from the ground up, Vanessa saw our family's resources as stepping stones to the glamorous life she felt she deserved. "You're wasting your potential here," she'd tell me during her increasingly rare visits home after college. "There's a whole world out there, Liz. One where people don't smell like fish bait and talk about the same neighbors they've had for 40 years. I never saw it that way. I loved our community, the way everyone knew each other, the rhythm of the tides that dictated our business hours, and the simple pleasures of watching the sunrise over the harbor with Grandpa while drinking tea from chipped mugs that had been in our family for generations. After our parents died in a car accident when I was 20, Vanessa was 23 then, Grandpa became our only family. While I moved back home to help him with both his grief and the business, Vanessa used her portion of our parents' modest life insurance to move to Boston, where she pursued a career in finance and built a network of what she called the right kind of people. For 8 years, I worked alongside Grandpa, modernizing our shipping logistics, expanding our client base, and watching him age with the dignified grace that characterized everything he did. During those years, Vanessa's visits became annual. Events, always brief, always accompanied by not-so-subtle hints about how Grandpa should consider selling the business and enjoying his retirement. "You've worked hard enough, Grandpa," she'd say, perching on the arm of his favorite chair, her designer clothes starkly out of place in our modest living room. "You deserve to see the world, to live a little before." She never finished that sentence, but the implication hung in the air each time. Grandpa would just pat her hand and say, "My world is right here, sunshine. Always has been." I think that frustrated Vanessa more than anything, the way Grandpa found contentment in what she considered a small, insignificant life. She couldn't understand that his happiness came from connection, not acquisition. Then came the storm. Not a literal one, though we'd weathered plenty of those on the coast, but the kind that upends your life without warning. It started with a persistent cough that Grandpa tried to dismiss as just a winter thing. By spring, when it hadn't improved, I finally convinced him to see Dr. Mercer, who had been our family physician since before I was born. The tests came back with the worst possible news: stage 4 lung cancer, already spread to his liver. The prognosis was measured in months, not years. I was devastated. Grandpa, ever the pragmatist, simply nodded and asked, "What time do we have left, and how do we make the most of it?" The next few months became precious beyond measure. We closed the business on Fridays so Grandpa could teach me how to make his famous clam chowder. We sat on the porch swing watching sunsets while he told me stories about my grandmother, stories I'd heard before, but suddenly seemed infinitely more valuable. And in the evenings, when his energy waned, we sorted through old photographs, letters, and documents, organizing the history of our family for whatever came next. Vanessa came to visit when I called about the diagnosis, staying for a weekend, before urgent work commitments called her back to Boston. During that brief visit, I noticed her paying unusual attention to Grandpa's home office, asking casual questions about the business's finances and property holdings. "Just trying to understand what you're dealing with here," she explained when I questioned her. "You shouldn't have to shoulder all this alone." I wanted to believe her, wanted to think that beneath her ambition and distance, she still cared about our family. Maybe she did, in her way. As Grandpa's condition deteriorated, I moved from my small apartment above the harbor master's office back into my childhood bedroom to provide round-the-clock care. Between managing his medications, coordinating with hospice nurses, and trying to keep the business running enough to cover our expenses, I barely slept. Vanessa called more frequently during those weeks, always asking about Grandpa's condition, but also inquiring about business documents, property deeds, and bank accounts. "Just trying to make sure everything's in order," she'd say. "You've got enough on your plate with his care." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. In retrospect, I should have been more suspicious. But grief has a way of clouding judgment, and truthfully, I was grateful for any interest she showed, any connection to the sister I'd grown increasingly distant from over the years. 3 months after the diagnosis, on a crisp autumn morning when the harbor was shrouded in mist, Grandpa Theodore Carter took his last breath with his hand in mine. His final words to me were, "Remember, little fish, the true value of things isn't what they cost, but what they mean." I was shattered, adrift in a grief so profound it felt physical. For days, I moved through our family home like a ghost, touching his things, breathing in the lingering scent of his aftershave on his sweaters, and trying to accept that the man who had been my anchor was gone. Vanessa arrived the day after he passed, taking control of the funeral arrangements with an efficiency that was both helpful and somehow unsettling. She spoke with the lawyer, the funeral home, and the bank, presenting herself as the older sister stepping in to handle matters in my emotional state. "You focus on yourself right now," she insisted. "I'll take care of the practical details." The funeral was beautiful in its simplicity, just as Grandpa would have wanted. The entire harbor community turned out, sharing stories of how Theodore Carter had given them their first jobs, extended credit during hard seasons, or simply offered wisdom when they needed guidance. Through my tears, I felt a profound gratitude for the legacy he had built, not of wealth, but of respect and kindness. It was 2 days after the funeral when I collapsed. Later, doctors would explain it as a combination of exhaustion, grief, and a severe case of pneumonia that had been developing while my focus was entirely on Grandpa's care. I remember the room spinning as I reached for the kitchen counter, and then nothing until I woke up in the county hospital with tubes and monitors attached to my body. I spent 2 weeks in that hospital bed, drifting in and out of consciousness, as aggressive antibiotics fought the infection in my lungs. During moments of clarity, I asked about the business, about Grandpa's estate matters, about whether anyone had fed the stray cat that visited our back porch each morning. The nurses would just pat my hand and tell me to focus on getting better. It was during my 2nd week there that I had a visitor I didn't expect. Martin Reeves, the harbor master and a lifelong friend of Grandpa's. His weathered face was grim as he pulled a chair to my bedside. "I wouldn't bother you with this if it weren't important, Eliza," he said, his voice low. "But things are happening at the harbor that don't sit right with me." Through his hesitant explanation, I learned that Vanessa had been meeting with a real estate developer from Portland. There were rumors of selling not just our family business, but several adjoining properties that had been in Grandpa's possession. "I tried calling you, but your phone goes straight to voicemail," Martin explained. "And when I went by the house to check, your sister said you weren't accepting visitors." I hadn't even known my phone was missing. Reaching weakly to the bedside table, I realized it wasn't there, nor was my wallet or house keys. Martin's news sent my heart monitor spiking, enough to bring a nurse hurrying in. After she'd checked my vitals and left with a warning about staying calm, I asked Martin if he could bring me my laptop from home. "I need to see what's happening with the accounts," I explained, a cold dread settling in my stomach. Martin returned. The next day, his expression even more troubled. "Your sister wouldn't let me in," he reported. "Said she was cleaning and rearranging things for when you got back. But Eliza—" He hesitated, then reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded newspaper. "You might want to see this." It was a listing from the real estate section of the Portland Press. There, in crisp black and white, was a photo of our family. Property, the house, the business offices, and the waterfront access, listed for sale as a prime development opportunity. The contact was a real estate agency in Boston, but the owner was listed as Eliza Carter. The shock must have shown on my face because Martin quickly poured me a cup of water from the bedside pitcher. "I thought you should know," he said grimly. "Something's not right here." "But she can't sell it," I protested weakly. "Grandpa's will—" Martin shook his head. "Word around town is that your grandfather left everything to Vanessa as the eldest. That's what she's been telling folks anyway." That couldn't be right. Grandpa had always been meticulous about his affairs. During those last months, we had discussed his wishes clearly. The business was to be mine if I wanted it, or sold with proceeds split between Vanessa and me if I didn't. The house was to remain in the family, not sold off to developers who would tear it down for condominiums. "I need to get out of here," I said, trying to push myself upright only to be hit with a wave of dizziness. "You need to get well first," Martin countered firmly. "Look, my daughter works at First Maritime Bank. She can't tell me specifics because of confidentiality, but she mentioned that there's been unusual activity on your family accounts. Large transfers, account closures." My blood ran cold. The business had been profitable, not extravagantly so, but steadily. And Grandpa had always been a saver, living well below his means. There should have been significant reserves in those accounts. "The will reading," I said suddenly. "Has it happened yet?" Martin shook his head. "Scheduled for next Tuesday at Reynolds' law office. That's still 5 days away." I took a deep breath, wincing at the pain in my chest. "Martin, I need a favor. A big one." Over the next 4 days, through the help of Martin, his daughter Emily at the bank, and a nurse named Diane who had known my grandfather for decades, I pieced together what had been happening while I lay in that hospital bed. Vanessa had indeed been busy. Bank records that Emily accidentally left visible on her tablet during a visit showed that over $340,000 had been transferred from our family business account to a personal account in Vanessa's name. The transfer had happened the very day after I was admitted to the hospital. Property records at the county clerk's office, which Martin's fishing buddy happened to work at, showed that Vanessa had filed paperwork claiming to have power of attorney for me, allowing her to move forward with property transactions in our family's name. Most disturbing of all was the copy of what purported to be Grandpa's will, a document dated just 2 months before his death that left everything to Vanessa, with a small monthly stipend for my basic needs. It cited my lack of business acumen and emotional instability as reasons for this division. Anyone who knew Grandpa would know this was absurd. Not only had he trusted me with the business for years, but he had also explicitly told me his intentions for the inheritance. But proving that would be difficult, especially in my weakened state. By Monday, the day before the official will reading, I was still too weak to be discharged. Pneumonia had taken a greater toll on my body than I'd realized, and though the infection was clearing, my strength was returning painfully slowly. "You can't make it to the will reading," Dr. Patel told me bluntly during his morning rounds. "Your lungs need at least another week of recovery before you should be exerting yourself." I thought of Vanessa sitting there while Mr. Reynolds, the family lawyer, read out the fraudulent will. I thought of our family legacy being sold off piece by piece. I thought of Grandpa's final words about the true value of things. "I have to be there," I insisted. Dr. Patel frowned. "Even if I agreed, which I don't, you're still on IV antibiotics. You can't just unplug and leave." That's when Diane, my night shift nurse, spoke up from where she was checking my medications. "What if we arranged for a temporary discharge? With portable oxygen and a wheelchair, just for a few hours?" Dr. Patel looked skeptical, but Diane continued. "I could accompany her as a medical escort, ensure she doesn't overexert herself." "This is highly irregular," the doctor protested. "So is someone stealing their sister's inheritance while she's hospitalized," Diane replied calmly. "I could have hugged her if I had the strength." After much debate and my signing of several liability waivers, it was arranged. I would be temporarily discharged for 4 hours the following day, accompanied by Diane, with portable oxygen and strict instructions to return immediately if my condition deteriorated in any way. That night, I barely slept, partly from the discomfort in my lungs, but mostly from the anxiety of confronting Vanessa and whatever scheme she had constructed in my absence. Martin visited early Tuesday morning, bringing me a set of clean clothes and a small envelope. "Emily found this in the bank's safe deposit records," he explained. "Your grandfather accessed his box 2 weeks before he passed." Inside the envelope was a receipt for the contents removed that day, a sealed letter addressed to Mr. Reynolds, the family lawyer, with instructions that it be opened only at the official reading of his will. A small flame of hope kindled in my chest. Perhaps Grandpa had anticipated something like this. He had always been more perceptive than people gave him credit for. At 1:45 p.m., wearing clothes that now hung loosely on my frame and with an oxygen tube in my nose, I was wheeled out of the hospital by Diane and helped into Martin's truck. The drive to Reynolds' law office took only 15 minutes, but it felt like crossing an ocean. "Ready?" Martin asked as he parked in front of the modest brick building where Grandpa had conducted his legal affairs for over 40 years. I nodded, though ready was the last thing I felt. My hands trembled not just from weakness but from the magnitude of what I was about to face. If the fraudulent will was accepted, I wouldn't just lose my inheritance. I would lose the last connection to the life Grandpa and I had built together. Diane adjusted my oxygen tank on the back of the wheelchair. "Remember, slow breaths. No matter what happens in there, your health comes first." With Martin holding the door and Diane pushing my wheelchair, we entered the law office at precisely 2 p.m., the scheduled time for the reading of Theodore Carter's last will and testament. The small conference room fell silent as we entered. Seated around the polished oak table were Mr. Reynolds, his legal assistant, 2 witnesses I didn't recognize, and Vanessa, dressed impeccably in a black designer suit that probably cost more than a month's profit from our family business. The shock on her face at seeing me was quickly masked with concern. "Eliza, what are you doing here? You should be in the hospital." She rose as if to come to my aid, every inch the worried older sister. "I wouldn't miss this for the world," I replied, my voice raspy but determined as Diane positioned my wheelchair at the table across from Vanessa. Mr. Reynolds, a man in his 60s who had known our family for decades, looked genuinely surprised to see me. "Miss Carter, we weren't expecting you given your condition. Are you sure you're up to this proceeding?" "Absolutely certain," I said, meeting his gaze steadily despite the oxygen tube and my obvious frailty. Vanessa resumed her seat, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming once on the table before she stilled them. "Well, I suppose we should get started then. I'm sure Eliza needs to return to the hospital soon." Mr. Reynolds nodded, adjusting his glasses as he opened a folder before him. "We are gathered to read the last will and testament of Theodore James Carter," he began formally. "Before I begin, I must note that I received 2 documents purporting to be Mr. Carter's final will." At this, Vanessa's composure slipped just slightly, a tightening around her eyes, a pause in her breathing. The first, Mr. Reynolds continued, was submitted by Vanessa Carter 3 days after her grandfather's passing. It is dated September 15th of last year. He held up a document that I recognized as the fraudulent will I'd been shown a copy of. The second, and here he reached into a drawer and removed an envelope sealed with wax, was entrusted to me directly by Theodore Carter 2 weeks before his death, with explicit instructions that it be opened only at this formal reading. The room was silent except for the soft hiss of my oxygen tank. Vanessa's face had gone very still, her earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist over the harbor. In addition, Mr. Reynolds added, Mr. Carter left a letter to be read before either will is considered. He broke the wax seal on the envelope and removed several pages of Grandpa's distinctive handwriting. Clearing his throat, Mr. Reynolds began to read. If this letter is being read, then I have passed on from this world, hopefully having lived a life that brought more light than darkness to those around me. Before my legal wishes are declared, I feel it necessary to explain certain choices, and to address what I fear may have already transpired by the time these words are heard. Mr. Reynolds's voice filled the quiet conference room as he continued, reading my grandfather's letter. First, to my granddaughters Vanessa and Eliza. You two represent different sides of my own nature, the ambition that drove me to build something from nothing, and the appreciation for community and connection that gave that something its meaning. I have loved you both equally, though perhaps in different ways. Vanessa, your drive and determination remind me of myself as a younger man, hungry for what I thought success looked like. That hunger took me away from precious moments with your grandmother that I can never reclaim. It wasn't until later in life that I realized success without purpose is like a ship without a destination. Powerful, perhaps, but ultimately adrift. Eliza, your compassion and loyalty to our community, your understanding that wealth is measured in more than dollars, these qualities reflect lessons that took me too long to learn. You recognized intuitively what cost me years of misplaced priorities to discover. Now, I must address a concern that has weighed heavily on me in my final months. Vanessa, during your last several visits, I noticed your questions focusing increasingly on financial matters rather than family ones. When you thought I was napping, I observed you searching through my office drawers, photographing documents with your phone, and accessing my computer files. At first, I told myself this was merely your way of preparing for the inevitable, an practical approach to an emotional time. But when I discovered a partially completed power of attorney form in my printer tray with forged signatures, mine and Eliza's, I could no longer ignore the pattern forming before me. It broke my heart to realize what you were planning, but I resolved not to confront you directly. Not because I feared the conflict, but because I hoped you might reconsider your path without intervention. I wanted to believe the granddaughter I raised still valued family bonds over financial gain. Perhaps that was my final act of foolish optimism. Instead of confrontation, I chose protection. I contacted Mr. Reynolds immediately and made arrangements to safeguard what truly matters. I also took precautions regarding the provisions in my will, anticipating that documents might be falsified after my passing. At this point in the reading, Vanessa's face had transformed completely, the composed, confident facade crumbling into barely concealed panic. She glanced toward the door as if calculating her escape route, but Martin had quietly positioned himself there, arms folded across his broad chest. Mr. Reynolds continued reading my grandfather's words. I have instructed Mr. Reynolds to accept only the will contained in this sealed envelope as authentic, regardless of what other documents may be presented. Furthermore, I have included dated photographs of the authentic will, notarized and witnessed, which have been stored with trusted friends and in my safety deposit box at First Maritime Bank. Now, to the matter of my estate and its distribution. The authentic will included here contains the detailed legal language, but I will summarize its contents. The family home on Harborview Road is to remain in the family, with Eliza granted lifetime residency rights. Should she choose to sell it, the proceeds must be divided equally between my granddaughters. The shipping business, Carter Maritime Services, passes to Eliza, who has effectively been running it for the past 5 years. Should she choose to sell, the proceeds are to be divided with 65% to Eliza and 35% to Vanessa, reflecting their respective contributions to its continued operation. My financial assets, including savings, investments, and insurance policies, are to be divided with 60% to Eliza and 40% to Vanessa. This division reflects my desire to support Eliza's continued stewardship of the family business while still providing Vanessa with substantial resources. However, and this is crucial, the above distributions are contingent upon one essential condition: that no attempt has been made by either granddaughter to circumvent my wishes through fraud, forgery, or coercion. Should such attempts be discovered and verified, the offending granddaughter's share shall be reduced to a monthly stipend of $2,000 for a period of 5 years, with the remainder of their portion donated to the Millbrook Harbor Community Foundation. Mr. Reynolds has been provided with documentation of suspicious activities I observed in my final months, which he is instructed to investigate should any irregularities arise during the execution of my will. Vanessa, if you are hearing this, it means you proceeded down the path I feared. Know that I forgive you, but forgiveness without accountability serves neither of us. Sometimes the most valuable inheritance is the lesson, not the legacy. Eliza, if you are facing challenges I anticipated, remember what I've told you since you were small. The true worth of a harbor isn't measured by the size of its ships, but by how well it shelters them through storms. To both my granddaughters, what you do with your inheritance, whether it be property, money, or the values I've tried to instill, is now your choice. Choose wisely, for in the end, we are remembered not for what we have, but for what we give. With enduring love and hope for both of you, Theodore James Carter. As Mr. Reynolds folded the letter, the silence in the room felt physical, a weight, pressing against my chest more forcefully than the pneumonia ever had. I stared at Vanessa across the table, searching for any remnant of the sister I'd grown up with. The one who had taught me to tie my shoes and had defended me from playground. Bullies before ambition had rewritten her priorities. The woman who stared back was a stranger to me, her expression cycling rapidly between shock, anger, calculation, and finally, a desperate attempt at damage control. This is ridiculous, she stammered, her voice higher than normal. Grandpa was on heavy medications during his final weeks. He was confused, paranoid. Eliza has been filling his head with— Ms. Carter, Mr. Reynolds interrupted firmly. Your grandfather was of sound mind when he entrusted this document to me. Dr. Mercer provided a signed statement confirming Theodore's mental competence, which is included with these papers. He tapped the sealed envelope. Furthermore, as your grandfather mentioned, there is substantial evidence supporting his concerns. He pulled a USB drive from the envelope. This contains security footage from your grandfather's home office, installed after he noticed documents missing. There are also bank records showing attempted access to accounts using his passwords after hours from IP addresses traced back to your Boston apartment. I watched as Vanessa's carefully constructed world collapsed around her. Her breathing became shallow, her manicured hands trembling slightly as she reached for her water glass. I want to see the footage, I said quietly, my voice still raspy from the hospital's dry air. Mr. Reynolds nodded. I've prepared copies of all evidence for both of you to review. But first, shall I proceed with reading the official will? I nodded, suddenly exhausted beyond measure. The adrenaline that had carried me to this moment was fading, leaving my body painfully aware of its weakened state. Diane noticed immediately, moving closer to check my pulse discreetly while Mr. Reynolds opened the sealed will. As he read through the legal document, the provisions matched exactly what Grandpa had outlined in his letter. Everything was precisely as he had told me it would be during those quiet evenings when we discussed the future, a future he knew he wouldn't see. When Mr. Reynolds finished, he looked up at Vanessa. Given the evidence presented and the clear instructions in this authenticated will, how do you wish to proceed, Ms. Carter? Vanessa's lawyer mask had returned, though considerably thinner than before. I'll need to review all documentation with my legal team before acknowledging anything, she said stiffly, and I reserve the right to contest. Contest away, Martin interrupted from his position by the door. But you might want to know that the district attorney's office has been provided with copies of everything we've discussed today, including evidence of bank fraud, attempted property theft, and forgery of power of attorney documents. Those are criminal matters, not just inheritance disputes. The color drained entirely from Vanessa's face. You're bluffing, she whispered. Martin shook his head. Theodore Carter was respected in this community for 50 years. Did you really think no one would help protect his legacy? Emily at the bank noticed the irregular transfers immediately. The only reason you weren't confronted sooner was because we were gathering evidence while Eliza recovered. I hadn't known this part. That while I lay fighting infection in my hospital bed, a network of people who had loved and respected my grandfather had been working to ensure his wishes were honored. The realization brought fresh tears to my eyes, but they weren't tears of grief this time. What happens now? I asked, looking from Mr. Reynolds to Vanessa. The lawyer cleared his throat. According to your grandfather's instructions, Ms. Vanessa Carter has a choice. She can accept the modified inheritance, the monthly stipend for 5 years, and no criminal charges will be filed. Or she can contest the will, in which case all evidence will be submitted in court and to law enforcement. Vanessa's breathing had become increasingly erratic. For a moment, I thought she might faint. Then she straightened, smoothing her skirt with trembling hands. This isn't over, she said. But the threat sounded hollow even to my ears. You have no idea who you're dealing with. My connections in Boston won't help you much in a fraud case with this much evidence, Mr. Reynolds interjected calmly. Your grandfather gave you an exit strategy, Vanessa. I suggest you consider it carefully. With that, she stood, gathered her designer handbag, and walked out without looking at me again. The sharp click of her heels on the hardwood floor echoed like the final notes of a discordant symphony. The next hour passed in a blur of signatures and explanations. Mr. Reynolds patiently outlined what would happen next: the invalidation of any documents Vanessa had submitted, the freezing of accounts she had accessed improperly, the legal process of restoring what had been taken. Through it all, I felt a curious mixture of vindication and sorrow. I had lost not only my grandfather, but also any hope of reconciliation with my sister. The victory felt necessary, but hollow. As Martin and Diane helped me back into the wheelchair, exhaustion crashed over me like a wave. The temporary discharge from the hospital had taken more out of me than I'd anticipated, and my lungs burned with each breath despite the supplemental oxygen. Let's get you back, Diane said gently, noting my pallor. But as they wheeled me toward the door, Mr. Reynolds called out, "One moment, Eliza. There's one more thing." He approached with a small wooden box I recognized immediately, Grandpa's keepsake box that had always sat on his bedside table. Your grandfather asks that this be given to you privately, after the will reading, he explained, placing it carefully in my lap. The smooth mahogany was warm under my fingers, as if it still carried something of Grandpa's essence. I ran my thumb over the small brass plate on the lid, engraved with a simple compass rose. Grandpa's reminder that it was always possible to find your way home, no matter how far you'd wandered. Thank you, I whispered, clutching the box as Martin wheeled me out to his truck. The return journey to the hospital passed in silence, each of us processing what had transpired. My physical discomfort seemed disconnected from me now, as if happening to someone else. My mind was filled instead with Grandpa's words, with the revelation of Vanessa's betrayal and with the curious contents of the box in my lap. Once I was settled back in my hospital room, reconnected to the monitors and IV antibiotics, Diane and Martin tactfully excused themselves to give me privacy. With trembling fingers, I lifted the lid of the mahogany box. Inside were several items I recognized immediately: Grandma's wedding ring, Grandpa's service medal from the war, a small piece of driftwood carved into the shape of a boat that I had given him for his 60th birthday. But nestled among these familiar treasures was an envelope with my name written in his steady hand. Taking a deep breath that sent pain shooting through my chest, I opened it carefully and began to read. My dearest Eliza, if you're reading this, then the storm I feared has come to pass, and you've weathered it as I knew you would. I'm sorry for the pain this has caused you, especially coming so soon after my departure. I debated for many nights whether I should confront Vanessa directly about what she was planning. Each time, I concluded that doing so would only drive her to be more secretive, more determined. Some lessons cannot be taught. They must be learned through consequence. What happened today isn't truly about money or property. It's about values, about choices, about the person you become when no one is watching. You might be feeling a mixture of vindication and loss right now. Both are appropriate. Justice without compassion becomes merely punishment, but compassion without justice becomes merely weakness. Finding the balance between them is life's most challenging navigation. I want you to know that I don't consider Vanessa's path a failure of my parenting or your sisterhood. Each soul charts its own course eventually. Some sail toward lighthouses, others toward sirens. We can offer maps and warnings, but we cannot steer ships that aren't ours to command. Now about your inheritance. The legal documents outline what you receive, but not what I hope you'll do with it. The business, the house, the financial assets, these are tools, not treasures. Use them to build the life that brings you joy, not the one others expect. If the business no longer serves your purpose, don't cling to it out of loyalty to me. If the house feels too empty without family to fill it, find one that feels like home. The greatest tribute you can pay me is not to preserve what I built, but to create what fulfills you. As for Vanessa, leave the door ajar if you can. Not wide. Open, that would dishonor the pain her actions have caused, but not permanently locked either. People change. Sometimes it takes years, sometimes decades, sometimes never. But the possibility exists, and with it, hope. Finally, remember that while inheritance comes to us through blood or law, legacy is what we choose to pass on. Be intentional about yours. In your hands, I trust that both the tangible and intangible gifts I've left will grow into something even more valuable. Navigate by your own stars, little fish. I'll be watching proudly from mine. All my love, Grandpa. By the time I finished reading, tears streamed freely down my face, dropping onto the paper and blurring the ink. I carefully folded the letter and held it against my heart, feeling as if Grandpa were somehow present, his weathered hand on my shoulder as it had been so many times throughout my life. In that sterile hospital room, surrounded by beeping monitors and the antiseptic smell of illness, I made a silent promise. Not just to honor Grandpa's wishes for the inheritance, but to embody the wisdom behind them. The weeks that followed were a gradual climb back to health and a step-by-step reclamation of what had been taken. Mr. Reynolds and his team methodically reversed Vanessa's financial maneuvers, recovering most of the transferred funds and halting the property sales she had initiated. Martin and his network of harbor friends kept the business minimally operational while I recovered, ensuring our clients knew the situation was temporary. Dr. Mercer adjusted my treatment plan to include home visits once I was discharged, saving me trips back to the hospital. Throughout it all, there was no word from Vanessa. According to Mr. Reynolds, she had accepted the stipend arrangement rather than face criminal charges, signing the necessary documentation through her lawyer without appearing in person. Part of me was relieved not to face her. Another part ached, for closure that might never come. 6 weeks after the will reading, I finally returned to Grandpa's house. My house now, though it would take time before it truly felt that way. Standing on the porch, keys in hand, I paused to listen to the distant sound of waves against the harbor walls, the calling of gulls, the familiar creaking of the wooden swing stirred by the breeze. Stepping inside was like entering a time capsule. Everything remained exactly as it had been the day I collapsed. Grandpa's reading glasses on the side table, my half-finished cup of tea still on the kitchen counter, now dried to a stain. The calendar on the wall still showed the month of his passing, as if time had frozen in my absence. That first night back was the hardest. The emptiness of the house seemed to amplify every creak and settling noise. I moved from room to room, touching familiar objects, breathing in lingering scents, feeling both comforted and haunted by memories. In Grandpa's study, I found evidence of Vanessa's hasty search, drawers not quite closed, files out of order, his desk calendar missing. Pages. Rather than anger me, the signs of her desperation filled me with a complex sadness. What emptiness had she been trying to fill with all this? I slept in my childhood bedroom rather than claim Grandpa's master suite, not yet ready for that transition. As I drifted between wakefulness and uneasy sleep, I could almost hear his voice in the creaking of the old house, offering the comfort and wisdom that had guided me all my life. The following morning, I woke to knocking at the front door. Opening it, I found a group of harbor workers and local business owners standing on my porch, tools in hand and determination on their faces. "We thought you might need some help getting things back in order," Martin explained, gesturing to the assembled crowd. "Folks are worried about you rattling around in this big house alone while you're still recovering." Over the next several days, the community that Grandpa had nurtured for decades repaid his kindness in full measure. They repaired the porch, railing that had been wobbly for years, repainted the weather-worn shutters, and cleared the garden of weeds that had flourished during my absence. Inside, they fixed leaky faucets, replaced burned-out light bulbs, and stocked my kitchen with more casseroles than I could eat in a month. During quiet moments between their bustling activity, many shared stories about Grandpa that I'd never heard. How he had quietly paid for the harbor master's daughter's college tuition when her scholarship fell through. How he had extended credit to struggling fishermen during lean seasons. How he had anonymously funded the restoration of the community center after a storm. "He never wanted recognition," Mrs. Townsend from the bakery explained as she organized my pantry. "Said true giving shouldn't come with applause." These revelations added new dimensions to the man I thought I'd known completely. They also provided a blueprint for how I might honor his legacy moving forward. By the end of that first week home, I felt strong enough to visit the business office at the harbor. The small, weathered building with Carter Maritime Services painted in fading blue letters on the door had been my second home for years. Now, stepping inside, I was struck by both its familiarity and the weight of responsibility it represented. Jenna, our part-time office manager who had been keeping basic operations running, greeted me with relieved enthusiasm. "Thank goodness you're back," she said, gesturing to the organized chaos of paperwork covering her desk. "I've been doing my best, but there are decisions I couldn't make without you." For the next few hours, we sorted through the backlog, client inquiries, maintenance schedules for the fleet, payroll questions, billing issues. The work was simultaneously exhausting and invigorating, like exercising muscles that had atrophied during my hospital stay. As the afternoon sun slanted through the office windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, I found myself standing at the large wall map where colored pins represented our shipping routes and client locations. Along the coast, Grandpa had started with just 3 pins. Now there were dozens, each representing relationships built on trust and reliability over decades. Running my fingers across the map, I heard Grandpa's voice from his letter. "If the business no longer serves your purpose, don't cling to it out of loyalty to me. The question settled in my mind like a stone dropped in still water, sending ripples of possibility outward. Did this business serve my purpose? Was this the life I wanted to build? Or was I simply following the path of least resistance? I had never seriously considered alternatives. The business had always been there. Grandpa had always needed me, and I had found genuine satisfaction in the work. But now, with both inheritance and agency in my hands, the horizon of possibilities had suddenly expanded. That evening, sitting on the porch swing with a cup of tea and the sound of waves in the distance, I allowed myself to truly contemplate what I wanted. Not what was expected, not what would honor Grandpa's memory, but what would fulfill my own dreams. The answer didn't come in a flash of insight, but in a gradual warming of certainty. I wanted to preserve what Grandpa had built, but adapt it for a changing world. Carter Maritime Services could evolve beyond just logistics and shipping, to become a hub for sustainable coastal business practices, perhaps even incorporating educational components about marine conservation. For the first time since the will reading, I felt genuine excitement about the future. Not just relief that disaster had been averted, but anticipation for what might be created from this inheritance of opportunity. As if responding to this shift in energy, my phone buzzed with a text notification. The number wasn't saved in my contacts, but I recognized it immediately. Vanessa's. The message was brief. "I'm sorry. Not for getting caught. For who I became. You deserved better. We both did." I stared at those words until the screen dimmed, then brightened it again with a touch. No excuses, no justifications, no requests for forgiveness or second chances. Just an acknowledgement of harm done. Was it enough? No. Was it a start? Perhaps. I remembered Grandpa's advice to leave the door ajar, not wide open, but not permanently locked either. With fingers that trembled slightly, I typed a response equally brief. "Thank you for saying that. I hope you find what you're actually looking for." Then I set the phone aside and returned my gaze to the harbor, where fishing boats were returning with their day's catch, navigating the channel markers Grandpa had helped install decades ago. The same waters, the same journey, repeated day after day, yet never quite identical. 3 months later, I stood at the podium in the community center, facing a room filled with familiar faces, the harbor workers, local business owners, and families who had been part of the Carter legacy for generations. Behind me, a projection screen displayed the new logo for the Carter Maritime Heritage Foundation. My grandfather believed that a community is only as strong as its connection to both past and future, I began, my voice now clear of the raspiness that had lingered after my illness. Today, we honor that belief by transforming Carter Maritime Services into something that preserves our heritage while creating new opportunities for the next generation. The plan I outlined transformed our family business into a non-profit foundation with 3 branches. The original shipping and logistics services that would continue to support local fisheries, an educational center offering maritime skills, training and environmental stewardship programs, and a community investment fund to support sustainable coastal businesses. A third of the foundation's proceeds will be dedicated to scholarships for local students pursuing careers in marine conservation, sustainable fishing practices, or maritime technologies, I explained. Because, as my grandfather often said, the true value of things isn't what they cost, but what they mean. As I concluded my presentation and opened the floor for questions, my gaze caught on a figure standing at the back of the room, partially hidden in the shadow of the doorway. Vanessa, her designer clothes exchanged for simple jeans and a sweater, her expression unreadable from this distance. Our eyes locked briefly across the crowded room. She gave a small nod, not of reconciliation perhaps, but of recognition. Then she slipped out the door before anyone else noticed her presence. Later that evening, as volunteers helped clean, Up after the event, Martin approached me with a curious expression. "Was that your sister I saw earlier?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. I nodded, arranging chairs in a neat stack. Briefly. "You okay with that?" I considered the question honestly before answering. "I don't know yet, but I'm okay with not knowing." He nodded, understanding without needing further explanation. "Your grandfather would be proud, you know, not just of the foundation, but of how you've handled everything." "I hope so," I said, glancing around the community center that had hosted so many milestones in our town's history. "I'm trying to navigate by the stars he showed me, but sometimes I feel like I'm just making it up as I go along." Martin chuckled, the sound warm in the emptying room. "That's the secret no one tells you. We're all just making it up as we go along. The trick is doing it with purpose." Purpose. That was what Grandpa had tried to teach both Vanessa and me in different ways throughout our lives. That inheritance without purpose was just wealth. Easily gained, easily lost. But purpose combined with resources could create legacy. As I walked home along the harbor path, the setting sun painted the water in shades of gold and amber. A small fishing boat was coming in late, its running lights glimmering in the gathering dusk. From my perspective on shore, it seemed to be navigating purely by feel, by memory of channels traversed 1,000 times before. But I knew that wasn't true. Even the most experienced captains used navigation tools, trusted the markers and buoys, respected the maps while acknowledging that water and weather were ever-changing variables that required adaptation. That night, I placed Grandpa's compass rose on my bedside table, where the first light of morning would catch its brass surface. Not as a memorial to what was lost, but as a reminder of how to move forward, with tools of navigation, with purpose, and with the understanding that the journey itself was the true inheritance he had left me. 1 year after establishing the Carter Maritime Heritage Foundation, I stood at the edge of our newly renovated pier, watching as a group of high school students learned to navigate using traditional methods under the guidance of Captain Miguel, a retired Coast Guard officer who had joined our educational program. The morning sun glinted off the harbor waters, and the scent of salt and possibilities filled the air. "Miss Carter?" A young woman in a crisp blue uniform approached, clipboard in hand. "The investors from Portland are waiting in the conference room." "Thank you, Zoe," I replied, taking a final moment to appreciate the scene before me. These young people connecting to maritime traditions that stretched back generations in our community. This was the vision coming to life, day by day. The walk from the educational pier to our main offices took me through the heart of what we now called Carter Harbor Center, a thoughtfully renovated complex that housed our administrative offices, educational facilities, and community spaces. What had once been a utilitarian shipping office and warehouse had transformed into a vibrant hub that honored the past while embracing the future. As I approached the main building, I paused to straighten my blazer and gather my thoughts. The Führer. Meeting ahead represented an important crossroads for the foundation, potential investors interested in expanding our educational model to other coastal communities. It was an opportunity that both excited and intimidated me, stretching the boundaries of what I'd initially envisioned. Before entering, I touched the small compass rose pin affixed to my lapel, the same design from Grandpa's wooden box, now cast in silver as the foundation's emblem. It had become my talisman of sorts, a tactile reminder of both where I'd come from and where I aimed to go. "They're ready for you," Jenna whispered as I entered the office. She'd transitioned from part-time office manager to the foundation's full-time operations director, her natural organizational talents flourishing with increased responsibility. "The proposal packets are already distributed, and I've queued up the presentation." I nodded gratefully and took a deep breath before entering the conference room where 5 visitors in business attire sat around our reclaimed wood table. A.E. piece salvaged from one of Grandpa's first fishing boats when it was decommissioned. "Good morning," I greeted them, extending my hand to each in turn. Thank you for making the trip to Millbrook Harbor. I'm Eliza Carter. For the next hour, I presented the Foundation's vision for regional expansion, detailing our successful pilot programs, community impact metrics, and the educational curriculum. We'd developed with marine conservation experts and local fishermen. The investors asked pointed questions about scalability, instructor training, and potential regulatory hurdles, all indicating serious consideration rather than mere curiosity. As the meeting concluded, Patricia Winters, the lead investor, lingered behind while her colleagues gathered their materials. "You've built something remarkable here," she said, her gaze direct and assessing, "especially considering the circumstances under which you took over." I felt my body tense slightly. The circumstances? She smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Word travels in financial circles, Ms. Carter. Your sister Vanessa used to move in the same Boston investment community as my husband. What situation with your inheritance wasn't entirely private?" The realization that my family's painful history had become gossip in wealthy Boston circles sent a wave of discomfort through me. I maintained my professional composure despite the internal turmoil. "The Foundation stands on its own merits," I replied evenly. "Its value isn't defined by the circumstances of its creation." Patricia nodded, something like respect flickering in her expression. "Precisely why we're interested. You've transformed what could have been merely a personal victory into a community asset." She extended her business card. "We'll be in touch within the week. I think there's potential here that extends beyond what even you've envisioned." After seeing the investors off, I retreated to my office. Grandpa's old space, now updated with sustainable materials and technology, but still containing his weathered desk that I couldn't bring myself to replace. The conversation with Patricia had unsettled me more than I wanted to admit, reopening questions about Vanessa that I'd carefully compartmentalized over the past year. Since her brief appearance at the Foundation's launch event, I'd received occasional text messages from her, impersonal updates about her life, never asking questions or initiating real conversation. She had moved from Boston to Seattle, started working with a sustainable investment firm, enrolled in graduate courses focused on environmental economics. Each message felt like a progress report submitted to a distant authority figure rather than communication between sisters. I never knew quite how to respond. My replies were similarly detached, polite acknowledgments without emotional investment. The chasm between us remained vast, though the sharp edges of betrayal had dulled somewhat with time and distance. Staring out the office window at the harbor activity below, I wondered what Grandpa would advise now. The Foundation was thriving, beyond my initial hopes, potentially expanding to impact more communities than I'd dreamed possible. The inheritance he'd protected had grown into something that honored his values while evolving beyond them. Yet personally, I remained anchored to past hurts, neither moving toward reconciliation nor fully releasing the possibility of it. My contemplation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Martin entered, his weathered face creased with concern. "Just got word from the Coast Guard," he said without preamble. "Storm system intensifying offshore, expected to hit us directly by tomorrow night. They're calling it a potential 50-year event." I straightened immediately. Hurricane preparedness protocols already running through my mind. Millbrook Harbor had weathered many storms over the decades, but extreme weather events had become more frequent and severe in recent years, a reality that the Foundation's conservation education addressed directly. "Alert the fleet captains," I said, shifting into crisis management mode. "Any vessels that can move to the inland marina should do so immediately. For the rest, double mooring lines and remove all non-essential equipment." The next 36 hours passed in a blur of activity. The Foundation team coordinated with local emergency services to prepare community shelters, secure vulnerable infrastructure, and ensure elderly residents had evacuation plans if needed. We converted our educational center into an emergency operations hub, its elevated position and robust construction making it safer than many local buildings. As darkness fell the following evening, the storm's leading edge brought driving rain and winds that bent the harbor's ornamental palms at alarming angles. From the educational center's observation deck, I watched anxiously as white-capped waves grew increasingly violent, slamming against the seawall that protected our most vulnerable facilities. Last weather update says we're looking at sustained winds of 70 miles per hour at peak, Jenna reported, joining me at the window. Storm surge potentially 4 to 6 feet above normal high tide. I nodded grimly. The new reinforced moorings should hold for most vessels, but that surge could overtop the lower docks. We had prepared as thoroughly as possible, but nature's raw power always held the final word. All we could do now was monitor, respond where safe to do so, and wait for morning to assess the damage. By midnight, the storm had intensified to a screaming fury that rattled windows and sent debris tumbling down streets. Our emergency teams maintained regular radio contact, reporting flooding in low-lying areas and power outages across most of the town. The foundation building, equipped with backup generators, became an island of light in the darkness. I moved between the communications center, where volunteers coordinated with emergency services, and the main hall, where displaced families had taken shelter. Despite the chaos outside, there was something profoundly moving about watching our community pull together. Neighbors comforting frightened children, local restaurants that had evacuated their perishable inventory, cooking hot meals on our emergency stoves, medical volunteers checking on elderly residents. Around 3 a.m, exhaustion finally caught up with me. Finding a quiet corner in what normally served as our administrative office, I sank into a chair, allowing myself a moment of vulnerable honesty. I was terrified. Not just for the physical structures at risk, the boats, the piers, the buildings, but for the community project that had become my life's purpose over the past year. As if echoing my thoughts, my phone buzzed with an incoming text. Expecting emergency updates, I was startled to see Vanessa's name on the screen. Watching news coverage of the storm hitting the Maine coast. Is Millbrook getting hit badly? Are you safe? The simple message, the first time she had asked about my welfare in over a year, caught me off guard. After a moment's hesitation, I responded honestly. In the foundation building with evacuees, towns mostly without power, harbor taking heavy damage. We're safe, but worried about what morning will reveal. Her reply came immediately. What can I do from here? Before I could respond, a volunteer burst into the room. Eliza! The seawall by the South Pier just failed, waters pouring into the boatyard. Pocketing my phone, I rushed back to the Emergency Operations Center, where the radio crackled with urgent reports. The breach wasn't catastrophic yet, but if it widened, several historic boats undergoing restoration in our traditional boat-building program would be at risk, along with valuable equipment and materials. Can we get sandbags there? I asked, studying the harbor map where team leaders had been marking affected areas. The emergency coordinator shook his head. Too dangerous until winds die down. Anyone going out there risks being hit by debris. For hours, we monitored the situation remotely through security cameras running on backup power, watching helplessly as water gradually rose in the boatyard. When the first pale light of dawn finally appeared, the wind had diminished enough to allow assessment teams to venture out in heavy rain gear. I joined Martin in his heavy-duty truck, driving carefully through streets littered with branches, shingles, and sections of fencing. The closer we got to the harbor, the more evident the storm's power became. Boats torn from moorings and flung against the shore, sections of dock splintered beyond recognition. The harbor master's office with its roof partially collapsed. Ew. The foundation complex, we found significant but not catastrophic damage. The educational center and main offices had weathered the storm well, thanks to recent reinforcement projects. The boatyard was flooded with 2 feet of seawater, but most valuable equipment had been moved to higher ground before the storm. 3 historic boats under restoration had sustained damage, but none appeared beyond repair. As we completed our assessment, making notes for insurance claims and recovery efforts, Martin placed a hand on my shoulder. "We've seen worse," he said simply. "This community rebuilt after the 78 storm, the 93 storm, and will rebuild after this one." His words, practical rather than sentimental, nevertheless filled me with renewed determination. This was the resilience Grandpa had valued, not the absence of setbacks, but the strength to face them and move forward. By midday, the storm had moved inland, leaving a soggy, battered landscape behind. Community members emerged from shelters and homes to begin the cleanup process, checking on neighbors and assessing damage. The Foundation's emergency response shifted to recovery mode, with staff coordinating volunteer teams, distributing supplies, and establishing a temporary medical station for minor injuries. In the midst of this activity, my phone rang with an unfamiliar Seattle area code. Stepping away from the noise, I answered. "Eliza Carter." "Eliza, it's Vanessa." The sound of her voice, not heard directly in over a year, sent a jolt through me. In our limited text exchanges, we had maintained careful distance. A phone call represented an unexpected crossing of established boundaries. "I saw the footage on national news," she continued when I didn't immediately respond. "It looks pretty devastating." "We've had significant damage," I admitted, watching volunteers clear debris from the walkway leading to the main building. "But structurally, most important facilities are intact, the community's pulling together." A pause stretched between us, heavy with unspoken history. "Listen," Vanessa finally said, her voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "I know I'm the last person who should be offering anything, but I've been working with climate resilience investors recently. There are funds specifically designated for coastal business recovery after extreme weather events. I could help navigate that process if you want." I leaned against a wall, momentarily overwhelmed by conflicting emotions. Suspicion, hope, confusion, a reflexive desire to reject any offer from the person who had tried to steal my inheritance. But beneath those immediate reactions lay something else, a recognition that recovery would require all available resources, regardless of their source. "That could be valuable," I acknowledged carefully. "We'll need to rebuild stronger than before. The forecasts show these events becoming more frequent." "I can email you information," she offered. "No strings attached. You can pursue it with or without my involvement." An emergency vehicle with flashing lights pulled into the parking area, drawing my attention. "I need to go," I said. "But yes, send the information, and thank you for calling." "Of course," she replied, then added more softly, "I'm glad you're safe." The call ended, leaving me with a curious sense of disorientation, as if something fundamental had shifted beneath my feet more profoundly than the storm's physical impact. The next 2 weeks passed in an exhausting cycle of cleanup, repairs, insurance negotiations, and community support efforts. The Foundation became a central hub for recovery activities. Our mission temporarily expanded to address immediate community needs. Through it all, I found myself drawing on reserves of strength and leadership capacity I hadn't known I possessed, making quick decisions that affected dozens of families and businesses. True to her word, Vanessa had emailed comprehensive information about disaster recovery funds, including several options I hadn't been aware of. The materials were professionally presented, clearly explained, and potentially game-changing for our rebuilding efforts. She had included her own analysis of which programs would best suit our specific situation, demonstrating both financial acumen and a surprisingly detailed understanding of what the Foundation had become. After reviewing everything thoroughly, I faced a decision that extended beyond practical considerations into uncomfortable personal territory, whether to accept not just the information, but Vanessa's implicit offer of more direct assistance. On the 15th day after the storm, I stood on our partially rebuilt main pier, watching the sunset paint the still unsettled harbor waters. Many vessels remained where the storm had tossed them, awaiting specialized equipment for recovery. The horizon, however, was clear, a reminder that even the most violent tempests eventually pass. "Thought I might find you here," Martin said, joining me at the railing. "Harbor Patrol found something you might want to see." He handed me a weathered piece of wood approximately 2 feet long, a section of hand-carved signage with peeling blue paint. Though damaged, the lettering was still legible. "Carter Mar." The rest had broken away, but I recognized it immediately as part of the original sign from when Grandpa had first opened the business. "Where was it?" I asked, running my fingers over the carved letters. "Washed up on the North Shore almost 3 miles from here," Martin replied. "Rode out the whole storm and came back to find you." I smiled at the sentiment, appreciating Martin's gift for finding meaning in practical things. "Like everything else around here, battered but not beaten." He nodded, gazing out at the harbor. "Recovery fund applications going okay?" "Actually, yes," I admitted. "Some of those programs Vanessa suggested are perfect fits for our situation. The Climate Resilience Grant could cover most of the seawall reconstruction with improvements." Martin raised an eyebrow, but didn't comment directly on Vanessa's involvement. Instead, he asked, "What's your gut telling you about next steps?" I considered the question, holding the weathered sign piece like a talisman, that this isn't just about rebuilding what was damaged, but about building something better, more resilient, more forward-thinking. I paused, organizing thoughts that had been forming throughout the recovery process. The foundation was always meant to bridge past and future. This storm has shown us exactly where that bridge needs strengthening. He nodded, seeming satisfied with my answer. "Theodore had the same look you have now, right after the '78 storm took out half the fleet. He didn't just replace what was lost, he reimagined the whole operation." The comparison to Grandpa warmed me deeply. "I'm considering accepting Vanessa's help," I said, watching Martin's reaction carefully. "Not just the information she sent, but her direct involvement with the funding applications. She understands the financial language better than anyone on our team." Martin was quiet for a long moment, his weathered face thoughtful as he looked out over the harbor. "Storms have a way of reshaping more than just shorelines," he finally said. "Sometimes they change the landscape between people too." 2 days later, I sent Vanessa an email outlining a proposal, a 3-month consulting arrangement with the foundation, focusing specifically on climate resilience funding and recovery strategy. The terms were professional, the compensation modest, but fair, the boundaries clearly defined. I had drafted and redrafted it multiple times, striving for a tone that was neither coldly businesslike nor falsely familiar. Her response came within hours. A simple acceptance of the terms, a proposed start date the following week, and a final line that stood apart from the business content. "Thank you for the opportunity to help repair something important." Whether she meant the foundation, the harbor, or something more personal remained ambiguous, perhaps intentionally so. The announcement to the foundation team was met with mixed reactions: confusion, concern, and in a few cases, outright skepticism. I addressed these head-on, acknowledging the complicated history while emphasizing the practical benefits of Vanessa's financial expertise during our recovery. "This isn't about forgiveness or forgetting," I explained during a staff meeting. "It's about utilizing every resource available to strengthen the foundation's future. We can establish appropriate boundaries while still benefiting from her specific skills." Jenna, who had been with me since before the will reading and knew the full story, pulled me aside afterward. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her loyalty evident in her concern. "After everything she did?" I considered the question seriously before answering. "I'm not sure about anything except that rebuilding requires resources we don't currently have. Vanessa has access to those resources and knowledge of how to secure them." I paused, then added more personally, "And maybe Grandpa was right about leaving doors ajar." The week before Vanessa's scheduled arrival, I found myself drawn repeatedly to the small beach behind the foundation property, where Grandpa had often taken me as a child to collect sea glass. The storm had churned up the shoreline, revealing previously buried layers and depositing new debris to be transformed by salt and sand. Bending to pick up a piece of blue glass, its edges already softened by the sea, I thought about transformation, how sharp, dangerous fragments could become, something valuable and beautiful through the persistent action of natural forces. The beach was littered with objects in various stages of this process, some still jagged and recognizable as broken bottles or dishware, others so smoothed by time that their origins were unidentifiable. Standing there, the inherited compass, rosepin on my lapel catching the afternoon sunlight, I realized that the coming months would require navigating personal terrain as challenging as any storm recovery. The decision to bring Vanessa temporarily back into my life, into the foundation that had risen from her attempted betrayal, wasn't just a practical business choice, but a test of my own capacity for growth. Would we ever rebuild the sister, relationship that had been shattered by her actions? I didn't know. Perhaps that wasn't even the right goal. But I did know that clinging to immovable positions would limit not just Vanessa's potential for change, but my own as well. As I collected a handful of sea glass pieces, fragments transformed by adversity into something new, I made a quiet commitment to approach the coming chapter with neither naive trust nor rigid suspicion, but with the same forward-looking resilience that was guiding our physical rebuilding efforts. The true test of an inheritance, after all, wasn't just what you received, but what you ultimately created from it. Not just material assets preserved, but wisdom applied to navigate whatever storms might come. The morning Vanessa was scheduled to arrive at the foundation, I woke before dawn, my mind cycling through potential scenarios and outcomes. After a restless hour trying to fall back asleep, I gave up and headed to the harbor, drawn to the calming rhythm of waves against the partially repaired seawall. The air held the particular crispness of early autumn, carrying hints of wood smoke from homes where people were just beginning to light morning fires against the chill. The foundation complex sat silhouetted against the lightening sky, its sturdy profile reassuring after the recent devastation. In the month since the storm, remarkable progress had been made. Debris cleared, temporary repairs completed, some semblance of normal operations resumed. Yet so much remained to be done. The damaged historic boats awaited restoration. The educational programs operated at reduced capacity in makeshift spaces. The compromised sections of seawall needed complete rebuilding with more resilient designs. These practical challenges I understood how to face. It was the personal challenge arriving on the 11:30 bus from Portland that filled me with uncertainty. "Morning, Fish." Martin's voice startled me from my thoughts. He joined me at the railing, 2 steaming travel mugs in hand. "Figured you might be out here overthinking things." I accepted the offered coffee with a grateful smile. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to those of us who've known you since you were knee-high." He took a sip from his own mug. "Your granddad used to do the same thing. Come watch the water whenever." He had a big decision to make. Said the tide has been solving problems longer than humans have been creating them. We stood in companionable silence as the harbor gradually came to life. Early fishing boats heading out, shop owners raising shutters, joggers taking advantage of the cool morning air. This rhythm of community had remained constant through storm and aftermath, a reassuring continuity. "What if this is a mistake?" I finally asked, voicing the fear that had chased sleep away. "What if bringing Vanessa here undermines everything we've built?" Martin considered this, his weathered face thoughtful. Might be, he acknowledged. No guarantee it won't. He turned to face me directly. But I remember another risk you took, when you decided to transform the business into a foundation. Plenty of folks thought that was foolish too. That was different, I protested. That was about the business, not. I trailed off, unable to articulate the complicated tangle of family, betrayal, and tentative reconciliation that made this situation so much more personal. Was it? Martin questioned. Seems to me both decisions come down to the same thing, whether you're going to let fear of what might go wrong stop you from finding out what might go right. As simple as his words were, they struck a chord of truth. Fear had been my companion these past weeks. Fear of making the wrong decision. Fear of being naive. Fear of disrupting the careful new life I'd constructed from the remnants of Grandpa's legacy. Besides, Martin added, the foundation is stronger than any one person's influence now. What you've built here has its own momentum, its own community roots. Even if things don't work out with Vanessa, what you've created won't crumble. I let his words settle over me, finding unexpected comfort in them. The foundation was no longer just my project or even Grandpa's legacy. It had become a true, community institution with its own resilient identity. Later that morning, standing in my office reviewing final preparations for Vanessa's arrival, I was interrupted by Jenna. The Portland bus arrived early, she reported, her expression carefully neutral. Your sister is in the reception area. Taking a steadying breath, I smoothed my blazer and touched the compass rosepin for reassurance. Thank you. I'll be right there. The walk from my office to reception felt both interminably long and far too short. Each step brought me closer, to a reunion I'd alternately dreaded and hesitantly anticipated for weeks. How would it feel to face Vanessa in person after everything that had happened? What version of my sister would I find waiting? The woman who stood examining the Foundation's mission statement mounted on the reception wall was simultaneously familiar and foreign. Vanessa's posture was still straight-backed and confident, her clothing still quality though less ostentatiously expensive than I remembered. But her hair, once highlighted and precisely styled, now fell in natural waves touched with early strands of gray she hadn't bothered to color. The makeup she'd never been seen without was now minimal, revealing freckles I'd forgotten she had. When she turned at the sound of my approach, I was struck by a subtle but profound shift in her eyes. A certain guardedness had been replaced by something more open, more present. Eliza, she said simply, making no move to initiate physical contact. Vanessa, I nodded, maintaining the professional distance we'd established in our communications. Welcome to the Foundation. How was your trip? Enlightening, she replied. I watched the coastline through the bus window. The storm damage is still evident all the way from Portland. But so is the rebuilding. The observation seemed pointed in its symbolism, but I kept to practical matters. We've set up an office for you in the East Wing. It's part of our temporary arrangement since the storm, but it has everything you should need. As I led her through the main building, introducing her to staff members with careful explanations of her temporary consulting role, I was acutely aware of the curious glances and whispered conversations that followed in our wake. Everyone knew some version of our history, though few understood the complete story. To her credit, Vanessa remained professional and appropriately humble in each interaction, neither overstepping boundaries nor shrinking from the occasionally cool receptions. She asked relevant questions about storm impacts and recovery priorities, took notes on structural vulnerabilities, and listened more than she spoke, a notable change from the sister I'd known. By lunch, we had completed the facility tour and reached the small office that would be hers for the next 3 months. The space was utilitarian but pleasant, with a window overlooking the harbor and walls decorated with historical maritime photographs from the Foundation's archives. This will work perfectly, she said, setting her laptop bag on the desk. I should compile my initial impressions while they're fresh. Would it be helpful to meet again at the end of the day to discuss priorities? I nodded, relieved by her focus on work rather than personal matters. 3:00 in the main conference room. I'll have Jenna send you the preliminary grant applications we've started. As I turned to leave, she spoke again, her tone shifting slightly. Eliza, She hesitated, then seemed to recalibrate. Thank you for this opportunity. I know it couldn't have been an easy decision. Meeting her gaze directly, I offered the most honest response I could. It wasn't, but the foundation's needs come first. The first week of Vanessa's consultancy established a workable rhythm. Our interactions remained professionally cordial, focused entirely on recovery strategies and funding opportunities. She attended meetings, reviewed documents, conducted research, and gradually developed a comprehensive funding approach that impressed even our most skeptical board members. These climate resilience grants could fund 60% of our seawall reconstruction, with improved design, she explained during a presentation. Combined with the historic preservation funds for the damaged boats and the community development block grant for educational facilities, we could emerge from this disaster with infrastructure significantly stronger than before the storm. What struck me most was how thoroughly she had internalized the foundation's mission, not just rebuilding what was, but evolving toward what could be. Her financial recommendations aligned perfectly with our values of sustainability, education, and community support. During her second week, she approached me after a particularly productive meeting. There's a site visit scheduled next Tuesday for the Resilience Grant Committee, she said. They're evaluating finalists for the regional fund. It would strengthen our application considerably if they could see firsthand how we've integrated educational components with practical harbor infrastructure. I'll lead the tour myself, I offered. Actually, she said, hesitation evident in her voice. They've specifically requested that the financial strategist participate. Apparently, they've had issues with previous grantees where the financial and operational visions weren't aligned. I understood the implication immediately. Vanessa and I would need to present a united front to the committee, demonstrating seamless integration between the Foundation's mission and its financial strategy. Fine, I agreed. We'll conduct the site visit together. Over the weekend, I found myself uncharacteristically anxious about the upcoming grant committee visit. Not because I doubted our qualifications or Vanessa's preparation, but because it would be our first real test of collaboration beyond conference room discussions. How would we function as a team after so many years of growing distance followed? By outright betrayal? By Tuesday morning, I had reviewed our grant applications so thoroughly, I could recite sections from memory. Vanessa and I had agreed to meet an hour before the committee's arrival to align our presentations and address any last-minute concerns. When I entered the conference room at the appointed time, I found her already there, surrounded by neatly organized documents, a detailed harbor map, and what appeared to be architectural renderings. I took the liberty of asking Emil from Portland, maritime architects, to create preliminary visualizations of the enhanced seawall design, she explained, gesturing to the renderings. They'll help the committee envision how their funding would translate to concrete improvements. I examined the drawings with growing appreciation. The design incorporated educational viewing platforms, marine ecosystem monitoring stations, and innovative wave-dissipating structures that would protect the harbor while creating artificial reef habitats. These are impressive, I acknowledged. But won't the committee see this as presumptuous, commissioning designs before funding is secured? Vanessa shook her head. Emil did these as a professional courtesy. He's hoping for the contract eventually, of course, but these are conceptual, only enough to demonstrate thoughtful planning without presuming approval. She hesitated, then added, I may have leveraged some old Boston connections to expedite the favor. The admission surprised me. Not just her use of former networking contacts to benefit the foundation, but her transparency about doing so. The Vanessa I'd known would have presented the renderings as entirely her own achievement. Before I could respond, Jenna appeared at the door. "The grant committee members are arriving. They're a bit early." For the next 3 hours, Vanessa and I guided 4 committee members through the foundation facilities, the damaged sections of harbor, and our proposed recovery plan. To my surprise, we fell into an effective rhythm. Her financial acumen complementing, my operational knowledge, my community connections balancing her strategic perspective. When questions arose about budget details, I deferred to her expertise without hesitation. When discussions touched on community impact, she seamlessly redirected to my deeper local knowledge. The integration of economic resilience with educational programming is particularly impressive, noted Dr. Elaine Hayashi, the committee chair, as we concluded the tour at the damaged historic boatyard. "Most organizations treat these as separate initiatives, but you've demonstrated how they reinforce each other." "That integration is the foundation's defining principle," Vanessa responded. "It's not something we developed for this grant application. It's embedded in everything from staff training to program design." She glanced at me. Eliza recognized this potential from the beginning. The acknowledgement, unexpected and unnecessary from a purely strategic perspective, caught me off guard. I recovered quickly, elaborating on our educational philosophy while the committee members took notes. Yet internally, I was processing this small but significant departure from our carefully maintained professional boundaries. Later that afternoon, after the committee departed with promises of decisions within 2 weeks, Vanessa and I found ourselves alone in my office reviewing the visit. "I think it went well," she offered, gathering her notes. Dr. Hayashi's questions about long-term maintenance costs suggested she's thinking beyond initial funding to implementation. I nodded, still distracted by her earlier comment. "You didn't need to credit me for the integration concept," I said finally. "The committee doesn't care about individual contributions." Vanessa paused in her organizing, meeting my gaze directly. "It wasn't for the committee," she said simply. "It was just the truth." The statement hung between us, disrupting the careful professional dynamic we'd maintained. For the first time since her arrival, we were approaching territory beyond grant, applications and recovery strategies, entering the shadowed landscape of our fractured relationship. "Truth didn't seem to be a priority for you during the will situation," I said, immediately regretting the words even as they left my mouth. We had tacitly agreed to focus on present work, not past grievances. Instead of becoming defensive or withdrawing, Vanessa set her papers down and took a seat across from me. "I deserve that," she acknowledged quietly. "And worse." Her acceptance of criticism rather than deflection represented yet another departure from the sister I had known. I found myself genuinely curious about this evolution. "What happened, Vanessa?" I asked. "Not just with Grandpa's will, but with you? Something's changed." She looked out the window toward the harbor, gathering her thoughts before responding. The easy answer would be that getting caught trying to steal your inheritance was a wake-up call, that facing consequences changed me. She shook her head. But that would be another lie. The truth is that failing didn't change me. Succeeding wouldn't have either. Then what did? Time. Isolation. Losing everything that had defined my identity. Her voice remained steady, but her fingers traced restless patterns on the armrest. When I accepted Grandpa's stipend arrangement instead of facing criminal charges, I thought I was choosing the easier path. I didn't realize I was also choosing to confront myself without distractions or excuses. She continued, describing how her Boston connections had gradually evaporated as rumors of her financial misconduct spread. How former colleagues and friends had stopped returning calls once her reputation became a liability. How the carefully constructed persona she'd built had crumbled without external validation. "I moved to Seattle because no one knew me there," she explained. "Started over with entry-level work at a small environmental investment firm. Lived in a studio apartment that would have horrified the person I was before. And somewhere in that process of reduction, I started to recognize how much energy I'd been spending chasing things that never actually made me happy." I listened without interrupting, struck by the absence of self-pity in her account. There was no attempt to portray herself as a victim of circumstances or to minimize her culpability. The monthly stipend Grandpa arranged, which I'd initially seen as an insult, became a strange kind of gift, she continued. It was enough to meet basic needs, but not enough to avoid working or to maintain appearances. It forced me to rebuild from fundamentals. "And the sustainable investment focus?" I asked. "Was that just convenient given current market trends?" She smiled slightly, acknowledging the justified skepticism. "Initially, perhaps, but the work itself changed me. I started seeing patterns, how short-term profit mentality devastates long-term community resilience, how extraction without regeneration creates unsustainable systems." She gestured toward the harbor visible through the window. It wasn't hard to connect those patterns to what Grandpa had been trying to teach us all along. As she spoke, found myself drawn into a surprising realization. I believed her. Not because I wanted to, or because it would be convenient for the Foundation's grant applications, but because the transformation she described mirrored what I observed in her daily actions since arriving. The changes weren't performance, but integration, new values manifesting consistently across contexts. "When you contacted me after the storm," she continued, "I saw it as an unexpected chance to contribute something meaningful to the legacy I'd tried to steal." She met my gaze directly. "I don't expect forgiveness, Eliza. I don't even expect you to believe in my changes. I just want to help rebuild something important, even if my role is temporary." The raw honesty of this statement silenced my prepared responses. For weeks, I'd been braced for manipulation, for hidden agendas, for the sister I remembered. Instead, I was confronted with someone who seemed as changed by life's storms as our harbor had been by the physical one. "The grant committee will announce finalists next Friday," I said finally, retreating to safer professional territory. "If we make that cut, there will be a final presentation in Portland the following week." Vanessa accepted the conversational pivot without pressing further. "I'll prepare a financial sustainability model to strengthen that presentation," she replied, gathering her materials. "And Eliza? Thank you for listening." After she left, I remained at my desk long after sunset, watching the harbor lights reflect on the darkening water. The conversation had unsettled something in me, not just my perception of Vanessa, but my understanding of my own journey since Grandpa's death. Had I truly moved forward, or had I simply been building more sophisticated fortifications around old wounds? The Foundation's growth was real and meaningful, but had my personal growth kept pace? Vanessa seemed to have faced her failures and found a path toward authentic change. Had I been equally honest with myself about my own limitations and blind spots? These questions accompanied me through the following days as we continued our professional collaboration. I observed Vanessa more carefully, noting how she deflected credit to others, how she listened more than she spoke in meetings, how she seemed genuinely interested in the educational aspects of our work beyond their grant appeal. When Friday arrived with news that we had indeed made the finalist list for the Resilience Grant, the Foundation team gathered for an impromptu celebration. Standing somewhat apart from the group, I watched as Vanessa chatted with Jenna and Martin. Their initial resistance to her presence noticeably softened. "She's not what I expected," Jenna admitted later as we reviewed the finalist notification. "I came in ready to protect you from her, but she seems different," I finished. "I know. Is it real, do you think?" Jenna asked. "People can change, but rarely that dramatically." The question echoed my own ongoing internal debate. I'm not sure dramatic is the right word, I replied thoughtfully. It feels more like excavation. Like the storm uncovering layers of the beach, revealing what was buried rather than creating something entirely new. The imagery resonated, reminding me of the sea glass beach where I'd contemplated Vanessa's return. Perhaps true change wasn't about becoming someone else, but about allowing authentic aspects of oneself to emerge when artificial constructs were washed away. The weekend before our final grant presentation, I made an impulsive decision. Instead of preparing alone as I typically would, I invited Vanessa to join me for dinner at Grandpa's house, my house now, to finalize our approach. Her surprise at the invitation was evident, but she accepted with characteristic new restraint. I'll bring the working materials. Should I bring anything for dinner? Just yourself, I replied, feeling strangely nervous about hosting my own sister. I'm making Grandpa's clam chowder. When she arrived that evening, I noticed her hesitation at the threshold. This house that had once been her childhood home was now territory she entered as a guest. The subtle pain in her expression as she glanced at familiar photographs and furniture pieces revealed more than her careful words. It looks the same, she observed quietly, but different somehow. I've been making gradual changes, I explained, leading her to the kitchen where the chowder simmered. Updating some things, preserving others. The meal began awkwardly, our conversation stilted and overly focused on the upcoming presentation. But as the evening progressed and we moved from kitchen to living room with cups of coffee, something shifted. Perhaps it was the familiar setting, perhaps the absence of colleagues and observers, or perhaps simply the accumulated effect of weeks working toward shared goals. Do you remember when Grandpa taught us to navigate by stars? Vanessa asked unexpectedly, gesturing toward the clear night sky visible through the windows. You were terrified of being on the boat after dark, but he promised we wouldn't get lost as long as we could see Polaris. The memory surfaced vividly, me at 7, Vanessa at 10, huddled together under blankets in Grandpa's small fishing boat as he pointed out constellations and explained how sailors had found their way home for centuries before modern instruments. You made up stories about each constellation to distract me from being scared, I recalled. Elaborate adventures with sea monsters and pirate treasure. Vanessa smiled, the expression transforming her face into something closer to the sister I'd known before ambition and distance had come between us. I'd forgotten that, she admitted. I was so focused on who we became later that I lost touch with who we were before. As we reminisced, sharing memories both painful and precious, I realized we were navigating territory more complex than any grant application. The landscape of shared history and divergent paths, of betrayal and tentative reconnection. There were no easy answers, no clear routes forward, but perhaps there were stars to guide us if we remembered to look up. I don't know if we can ever rebuild what was broken, I said finally, voicing the thought that had circled in my mind throughout. Her consultancy. Too much has happened. Probably not, she agreed, surprising me with her frankness. But maybe we're not meant to rebuild the past. Maybe, like the foundation after the storm, we're meant to build something different, something that honors what came before while creating something more resilient. The echo of Grandpa's philosophy in her words struck me deeply. This was what he had tried to teach us both. That true inheritance wasn't about preserving unchanging forms, but about carrying forward essential values while adapting to new realities. The following week, we presented our final proposal to the Grant Committee in Portland. Our preparation paid off in a seamlessly integrated presentation that connected financial strategy to community impact, short-term recovery to long-term resilience. When we concluded, Dr. Hayashi's appreciative nod suggested good news might follow. Driving back to Millbrook Harbor together, Vanessa broached the subject we'd both been avoiding. My 3-month contract ends next week, she said, watching, the coastal scenery pass outside the car window. Whether or not we get the grant, the initial work will be complete. I kept my eyes on the road, acknowledging the approaching conclusion to our unexpected collaboration. What will you do next? Return to Seattle? She was quiet for a moment. I've been offered a position with a regional climate resilience fund, evaluating coastal business adaptations across New England. It would mean relocating to Boston again, but with very different work than before. The news shouldn't have surprised me. Vanessa's expertise in both finance and environmental sustainability made her valuable in an increasingly important field. Yet I felt an unexpected pang at the thought of her leaving just as we'd established a functional working relationship. That sounds like a good fit, I said, meaning it despite the complicated emotions beneath the words. When do they need an answer? By the end of the month, she replied. I wanted to see the Foundation's grant process through before deciding. We fell silent again as the road wound closer to home, the strengthening sea breeze finding its way through partially opened windows. On the horizon, Millbrook Harbor came into view, its waterfront profile altered by storm damage yet recognizably resilient. Whatever you decide, I said as we approached the Foundation complex, the door will remain ajar. She glanced at me, sharply, recognition flashing in her eyes, understanding my deliberate echo of Grandpa's words from his final letter. Neither of us spoke further on the subject, but something had been acknowledged between us. Not forgiveness exactly, but possibility. The potential for continued evolution rather than permanent estrangement. 3 days later, the grant committee announced their decision. The Carter Maritime Heritage Foundation had been awarded the full resilience funding package, $1. $2 million for comprehensive harbor infrastructure improvements with integrated educational components. The notification specifically cited our unique approach to community resilience through intergenerational knowledge transfer and forward-thinking adaptation strategies. As news spread through the foundation and town, impromptu celebrations erupted. Standing in the main hall surrounded by jubilant staff and community members, I found myself searching the crowd for Vanessa. I spotted her in conversation with Martin near the historical display, her expression quietly satisfied rather than triumphant. Our eyes met across the room, and in that moment of shared achievement, I felt something unexpected, not the completion of a journey, but the recognition of a continuing one. The path forward wouldn't be simple or straightforward. There would be storms and setbacks, necessary boundaries and careful navigation. But there would also be possibilities neither of us could yet envision. Like the harbor we were working to rebuild, our relationship had been fundamentally altered by forces beyond our control. What emerged wouldn't be a restoration of what was lost, but the creation of something new, shaped by difficult tides, strengthened by painful lessons, guided by inherited wisdom, but not bound by inherited patterns. In the end, perhaps that was Grandpa's most valuable legacy, not the business or the property or even the foundation that had grown from them, but the understanding that true resilience comes from learning to navigate change rather than resisting it. The compass he had given me wasn't meant to lead back to familiar harbors, but to guide exploration of uncharted waters. Looking around at what we had collectively built from the remnants of his legacy, a community strengthened rather than diminished. By adversity, a purpose expanded rather than constrained by challenges. I finally understood what he had tried to teach us from the beginning. The true value of inheritance isn't measured by what you receive, but by what you create from it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.